Welcome back. This is part four of our first module, Early European Contact with the Americas. In this last segment, we're going to think about the consequences of this interaction between the Old World and the New World. We'll see that some of the effects here are going to be consequences of any interaction between Europeans and natives. Some effects, though, are going to be a little more specific to particular European powers. I think probably one of the most significant developments, not just in American history, but really in global history, was something called the Columbian Exchange. This was basically an ecological transfer between the old world and the new. So European technology, things like metal technology, metal tools, guns, swords, things like that. Europeans bringing ideas, religion, and particularly plant and animal life. And you can see some examples of that here in the slide. Europeans bringing animals like cattle and horses with them to the New World. Horses had actually become extinct in the New World at this point. And when Europeans reintroduce animals like this, it's going to transform native cultures. So instead of some of these native cultures continuing to be farmers, some of them are going to instead become herdsmen, raising cattle, eventually becoming nomadic people on horseback, something that they were not originally. We really can't overstate just how significant a development this is. And it's a two-way street. It's not just things coming from the old world to the new. There are many plants and animals that are being brought from the new world back to the old. So you see some examples here in the slide, things like tomatoes, tobacco, something big that we'll talk more about in our next module. Also diseases, things like syphilis being brought from the new world back to the old. So this is really going to profoundly reshape the environment on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think we're still feeling the impact of this interaction 500 some years later. This has completely reshaped the world in which we live in today. One aspect of that Columbian Exchange was disease. So we talked about Europeans bringing diseases with them, malaria and smallpox, measles, things that natives really don't have any resistance to. Well, that is going to lead to the devastation of Native American populations. The results here are just catastrophic, and you can see that in the slide here. These are Native Americans suffering from smallpox. We don't have exact figures for just what the population in the New World was before Europeans showed up. Our best guess is that there were roughly 50 million people. And our best guess is that 90% of those people died, largely because of disease, warfare, and forced labor. So this population collapse is one of the big consequences of this interaction between Europeans and natives. One effect that I think is particularly a consequence of Spanish colonization is that it paves the way for African slavery to take hold in the New World. The Spanish had been generating wealth through these very labor-intensive activities, mining, plantation agriculture, and so forth. But the native labor force that they had relied on is very quickly depleted. So by the 1500s, the Spanish, they still need a workforce. They're increasingly going to start looking to Africa for slaves to supply that labor force. And other European powers very quickly follow suit. The Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, the English, they're all going to emulate what the Spanish are doing here in transporting Africans to the New World to serve as their primary labor force. Now, as far as consequences of the fur trade, I think there's kind of two pieces to this. There's an environmental effect, and then there's also a social effect. From an environmental standpoint, the Native Americans want the stuff that the French have to offer. They want the beads and the copper pots and the guns, and they're willing to kill as many animals as they have to in order to keep the flow of trade goods coming. They very quickly kill off most of the animals on their own traditional hunting grounds. So we start to see a significant decline in the animal population. That's kind of the environmental consequence. But there's a social element to this too. I've killed off most of the animals on my own turf. I still want to keep those trade goods coming. So I'm going to expand outward. I'm going to start hunting on another tribe's turf. That's going to bring me into conflict with this other tribe. They're not going to like it that I've overstepped their borders. It's going to lead to warfare between native cultures over access to animal hunting grounds and the access to the fur trade. And now that these native tribes have access to European weapons, guns and swords, now these fights are going to be a lot more lethal. In fact, we're going to see a complete reshaping of the balance of power within native tribes, as stronger tribes are going to use these new weapons to subdue weaker tribes. So essentially, I think the upshot to all of this is what we're saying is that the encounters between Europeans and natives are going to profoundly alter both societies. We see these population effects, we see environmental and ecological consequences, and ultimately it reshapes the balance of power on both sides of the Atlantic. The Aztec Empire is destroyed, and out of its ashes, we see Spain rising to build its own empire and become powerful in its own right. So one empire falls, another rises to take its place.